Morning, everyone. Welcome to this ITRL breakfast seminar. Today we have our colleague here, Erik Almlöf, that's going to present an interesting talk about the potential societal impacts of self-driving vehicles or automated vehicles. I guess you're going to get into the definitions as well. And my name is Jens Hagman, and I'm the new vice director here at ITRL. I think I'll take it away for you, Erik. Also, remember the instructions here. If you want to say something, raise your hands, and we're going to have questions in the end. So I think we'll let Erik talk his about 30-minute presentation. Okay, thank you. I'll leave the stage.
Okay, I'm going to start by just sharing my screen first and foremost. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seminar on the societal impacts of self-driving vehicles that I'm going to talk about for about 30-35 minutes or so. And this work is based on my licentiate thesis, which I defended in June, but that seminar was mostly on like method and so on, which is pretty common in academic circles. But we felt like there's a lot of content here that might be interesting for people to communicate to people and to kind of like sort of the conclusions that I've drawn so far from 4 years of study. And this is based on a lot of sort of an oversight that I did during the during my licentiate, and it's also published in a large table in that licentiate as well. And I think that Malin will maybe post a link later to the licentiate if you want to read up on all the sources as well. But I will talk mainly about four different types of, there's four different parts of this presentation. First of all, I will talk a bit about what self-driving technology is, sort of, and a bit of history as well. Then I will speak a bit about what I call low-level impacts, and then move on to societal impacts, which is the theme for this presentation. And then draw on some conclusions on what this might mean and sort of the takeaways that I think that we have at this moment from this research field. So first of all, what are we actually talking about here? There's a lot of different words used for this: self-driving, driverless, automated, autonomous. Might be others as well. Unmanned is sometimes used as well. And this is partly the same thing within this topic, but there are small differences as well. Automated driving is the preferred term according to the Sae, which is sort of a standard for our field. But I really prefer the self-driving just for the reason that it's kind of easy for laymen to understand what we're talking about. And it's sort of self-explanatory what we're actually considering when we say automated, because there's a lot of things that could be automated in a vehicle and are, in fact. But now we're talking about the driving in itself. So I kind of prefer this, but I won't go into all like the exact differences between these. It's not that important. I will kind of consider these to be synonyms within this talk as well. This is a scale that I think that some of you might be aware of. It's pretty commonly used as well. It's the SAE scale. And then this is kind of the standard that I was talking about previously. And in this scale, where there's 5 different steps here, or actually 6, because first of all, we have the no driving automation as well, which is level 0. But in this step as well, we actually have some sort of alerts that still help a driver to drive more safely or better in general. And then we have driver assistance on the first level, some sort of partial automation as well, conditional automation, which kind of means that automation works during some restrictions, but it might switch off at any given moment, basically. And then some sort of high or full automation. And this is what I will focus on during this talk. So some sort of high level here where we reach this like full automation or almost full as well, which is so parts of level 4 as well. But another area which is less talked about within this technology, and I think is extremely important to highlight. It's what is called an operational design domain, which is basically, okay, so within we say that we have these 6 different levels of automation, but the question is sort of where are we as well? So the operational design domain specifies where we are as well. We might have full automation on a highway, but no automation in dense cities, for example. Or it might be that we have full automation during the daytime, but no automation during nighttime as well, which is of course harder for a human being to drive in as well, because well, there's less light available, so it's less easy to see what's happening. But another important aspect is of course weather as well, and you see here on the image to the right, which is snow, and that's the thing, that there are a lot of trials going on within this field, but the thing is that people are mostly doing these tests in Arizona in the US, where they have 0 snow and in general pretty good weather. So it's sunny and well, fairly easy conditions, whereas we talk about Sweden here, we have a lot of snow for a lot of the time of year, which really puts a stress on the technology as well. And that's why it's also important to stress that we don't only have this like Sae scale, but also what are we kind of talking about this, like, okay, which domain are we actually able to automate in this well, whatever vehicle we're doing or whatever service that we're doing, and this might actually differ quite a lot. So highway driving is mostly what's being done now during tests, for example, which is of course a bit easier because there are no kids there. It's sort of entirely designed for vehicles, which makes it a lot easier. There's like clear markings, you have clear lanes, for example, which makes it a lot easier. I'm gonna go briefly a bit about the history about this as well, because I mean, the emergence of sort of self-driving cars started in, it's about like 12 years ago now, when Google sort of revealed their self-driving car and so on. But if you have a bit of a historic background, you can kind of see that this is of course not a wholly new technology. Automation in itself is of course, well, you could argue 250 years old, starting with the Industrial Revolution, where you sort of had machines that did things. But there are, of course, technology that's thousands of years old as well, which sort of helps human labor, or like reduces the need for human labor, for example. The first self-driving train that I'm aware of was in London, starting in the 60s. So that's quite a long time ago. But then again, we're talking about like the operational design domain. If you have your own track in its own tunnel, and it's not really supposed to be anything there, then of course it's somewhat easy to automate as well. Drive forward until you reach a station, or if something gets in the way. If something gets in the way, stop. Otherwise, drive. Sort of easy. Not entirely easy in practice, but you kind of get what I mean, I think. The first experiments with cars started actually in the 50s. That was quite rudimentary as well. What people did was basically that you could have, so it was sort of like a tram that you basically followed the electric line or something. And then I think in the 60s, they also had some sort of extremely easy imaging technology as well, where you basically had drawn these these white lines in the road, and then you had a camera facing the road and just like, okay, follow this white line. And that's kind of how they started as well. And then we had more advanced trials starting in the 80s and especially in the 90s, when I think that the first sort of trials on like public roads were done in Germany, from what I've understood at least. But what's interesting a bit, or I should add as well, that we actually have a self-driving bus in the Netherlands since 1999. Now, again, this is on its own track as well, its own roadway. So that's kind of the same thing. Just follow the roadway until you kind of, if there's something in the way, just stop. Otherwise, just drive. It still needs to turn as well to follow the roadway though. So it's a bit more advanced than a train, but still fairly easy. So we really have this like dedicated infrastructure for it as well. It's driven in, I think, in like an industrial complex as well, outside of, I don't know, some major city. So it's kind of an easy area to do as well. But still. And then, of course, we have a lot of automated vehicles available in mines, for example, which has been around for some time, but not that long. And of course, with like varying complexities as well here we're talking about. So that was a bit of history on kind of what I'm talking about when we're saying self-driving technology. What do I actually mean here? And I just wanted to really shortly explain before I go into impacts, what I consider to be sort of low level impacts and societal impacts. On the lower part here, you have some sort of like low level impacts where we're talking about impacts for individual people or smaller groups of people, or for individual vehicles or like a smaller group of vehicle. Could be, for example, how two vehicles interact, but we're not talking about big. And then I'm going to talk later about societal impact. So CO2 emissions could be the overall accident rate in Sweden, for example. So that's kind of what I mean by societal impact here. And if we start talking about low-level impacts there, I would argue that there are two different areas that will be affected by this. The first one is vehicle design. So how we design vehicles and how they behave in relation to each other and in itself as well. How do we drive, or whatever you want to call it? And the other area is human perception and human behavior as well. So how will this actually be perceived by people, and how will people behave, or how would this technology affect their behavior in some sense? And I'm going to start talking about the second area here, which is human perception and behavior then. And I'm going to start with, this is Eurobarometer. So it's a really big survey across all the EU where they've asked residents just, okay, to what extent would you feel comfortable or not comfortable traveling in a fully automated vehicle under the following conditions? And then we have a range from totally comfortable to not at all comfortable. So with the supervision of a human operator, well, most people are pretty okay. Yeah, I would feel comfortable if there's someone on board supervising this vehicle. But then we actually have 30% of the population who are like, no, I don't really want that. That doesn't feel safe, or no, that wouldn't feel good for some reason. If we then have some sort of remote supervision of a human operator, but no one on board, so you're just boarding a taxi, and then there's some sort of remote supervision that you don't really see or aren't aware of. Maybe there's some sort of contact information, but there's no one on board who's responsible. We kind of get the opposite picture instead. So there's in this case a minority who's comfortable with this, and around 60% who do not feel comfortable doing this as well. And I think that you'll probably guess the last here, without any human who's responsible for supervising this vehicle or making sure that it's doing everything as it should, then there's only like 20% of the population who feels like this is a good idea. And of course, these surveys kind of depend on how you phrase the question and so on. Not all people have actually heard about this, or they have an image of what they call an automated vehicle, for example. But kind of what needs to be taken away here is that we actually have a range as well, from some people who feel super comfortable about this and some people who are not comfortable at all using this. A lot of people like KTH, they feel like this is an awesome idea. A lot of technology early adopters here, I would assume. But if you go into the general public, it's a bit more of a mixed image, which is kind of when I talk to people about the subject, is kind of what I hear as well, that some people are really scared about this. Others are, yeah, cool. That was pretty good. So why would it be good then? Well, the obvious thing is that not having to drive your own car is, of course, some sort of less mental load for you. So you can actually focus on doing other things. You could sleep, for example. Might lead to more comfortable rides. I think that all of you have some sort of experience in riding with a good driver and a bad driver as well. For example, when riding a bus, sometimes you kind of almost don't feel the road in a sense because it's a really good driver, and sometimes they're just accelerating and braking at all points. And you could imagine that this could lead to more comfortable rides with sort of a machine that could be better than a human. I'm not saying that it is, but it could be, which could lead to you being able to read the newspaper, for example, which is awesome. Definitely less mental load, or take a break or something. However, we still have some sort of car sickness here as well. There is a factor in just driving and maintaining your eyes on the road, which sort of lessens car sickness to a large extent, because you're kind of feeling what's happening with the vehicle and your own, so the question is then, okay, what would actually happen with the car sickness in this case? Could be the same thing here, that we actually have large differences between groups. Some people are super comfortable using this and others not. I myself had once when I was riding a bus from Kalmar to Stockholm, I had some sort of image of me actually working on the way there. This was not doable for me because I got car sickness in a bus. I don't think that it was a particularly bad driver. It's just that going pretty fast on the road, and it's sort of like turning here and there as well, made me car sick. So this is sort of a problem, whilst others might not have this problem. So the other area as well, then vehicle design and behavior. And what's mostly sort of an important area, so sort of what people are saying, like, okay, why would we want self-driving cars, is to reduce accident rates. There's the motivation that human behavior, some sort of like human fallacy, is about 90% of all death due to accidents, at least in the Western world. And you could imagine that this could come down sort of when you don't have drunk self-driving technology, for example. But there's no real evidence for that this is actually the case. It might be that we have other types of accidents as well, that the human driver is really good at handling some situation, whilst we might get others. But maybe down could be, I'd say, potential for down, but not that it's actually going to go down in itself. Speed then. The idea here is basically that you have a vehicle that's better at monitoring the road, so that you can go faster. Or it could be that the vehicle sort of talks to the vehicle ahead as well, and can sort of, that they can communicate and sort of co-line so that they brake at the same time, for example. Could be the case. At the moment, these cars are driving really safely, defensively, and slow. And sort of, I'd say that the jury is definitely out here, and that it might be that we actually get more safe behavior in a sense from these drivers. Could be that they actually go faster as well once they feel comfortable. I don't know. Hard to tell. Road capacity then is about this like interaction between vehicles as well, which is a major factor here as well. It sort of has to do with how people, or how vehicles, I should say in this sense, actually drive during congestion, for example, when there's a long queue of vehicles. and most people aren't really doing the behavior that researchers within road capacity want them to do. So you could imagine that this could actually go up. But then you have some sort of like idea that these vehicles would actually do the behavior that's optimal for the entire traffic system and not for themselves. So for example, going in, trying to like squeeze in before someone else is good for me, but it's bad for the traffic system overall. Would these vehicles work more towards the overall goal or for their own goal? I don't really know. That the vehicles will actually communicate with each other. I'm not sure that Volvo and BMW will actually share information between them as well, or if it's actually doable that they will share information as well. They might have different platforms for sharing information, for example. So could go up, maybe not. When it comes to energy consumption, then I think that most research points to that this will probably go down, with sort of the assumption that these vehicles will drive better than a human driver, more eco driving, so to say, which is probably a bit likely, but not necessarily true. Then vehicle cost, which is, I think that this is not that surprising, extremely high cost at this point to fit a vehicle with LiDARs and advanced computers and so on. But we could probably see that this would go down over time as all technology sort of like becomes cheaper after a while when it's sort of matured and so on. But then we also have a few other impacts that could come from this as well. First of all, there's this like, okay, you don't need to park your car. You can just hop in your car, go to work, and you don't need to search for parking. The car would just drive itself away. But where? Will it just drive around while waiting for you? Where will it drive to park in the meantime? These are questions which aren't really answered in a good way, I would say. And could lead to big problems. There are definitely, in some places, it's a lot cheaper to just drive around than paying the parking fee. And I don't think that most cities would want that as well, with cars just driving around constantly. But then we would need some sort of policy to prohibit that. Then sharing vehicles as well. And this is a big topic when it comes to self-driving technology. Or a big sort of like motivation for it as well. It's actually somewhat of a different, I would argue, a different, not really technology in itself, but something that could be possible due to the technology. And first of all, just this, okay, so my car could drive me to work, then go and pick up my kid and drive him to school, which is usually called some sort of car sharing or vehicle sharing, that the vehicle is used by me, then it's used by someone else, and then it's used by someone else, and then it comes to pick me up when I actually need it as well. But sometimes this is misinterpreted or sort of like mixed in with what I would call trip sharing as well, which is when multiple people are using the vehicle at one time. So the vehicle is picking me up, then it's picking up my coworker as well, and then someone else drive this third person to their workplace, and then me and my coworker to our workplace, for example. And this is called trip sharing. So it's not the same as sharing the vehicle with like that other people can use the same vehicle, but more like, okay, but multiple people are using this. Carpooling it's basically the same thing. And these are two different types of things, and you could imagine both of these. Car sharing can be done, for example, within a family, which is fairly simple. That's kind of how we use a car today, within the household, so to say. But it could also be that the car is used among different individuals as well, different households. A taxi, for example, which is a good example of this. But it could also be that we're actually using cars much more to have multiple people using the same vehicle, sort of like a bus instead, or taxi pooling, but that's quite uncommon at the moment. But there are other issues with this as well, if we remove the driver. The first one is who cleans these vehicles. Taxi drivers actually do quite a lot of cleaning. And there are estimates that this could actually be one of the major factors if you would have a self-driving taxi fleet, that this would actually be one of the major cost components is cleaning. Because you don't have this person who like, okay, I'll drop someone off, just check in the back, okay, remove one or two things. In this case, you would actually need to go to a garage or something to clean this, for example, extremely cost inefficient. And on the same note, who does this like simple maintenance as well? Who checks on the warning for low air pressure in one of the tires, for example, and kind of feels like, no, this is okay, I can drive a bit more, I'll do this later instead. Would you always have to go to the mechanic when there's some sort of error? Because that's not how drivers usually do, for good and bad, I think. And who answers the questions that I have while I'm going to go to a new place by bus, for example? Yeah, I'm going to this place. Well, which stop is that? Could you just call out when my stop is next? Which is a pretty common thing for buses, but also for taxis. Sometimes you don't really know where you're going, and then you need someone with some experience, which taxi drivers and bus drivers usually have. And who plans the itinerary? You sort of have some sort of schedule usually. Okay, I'm going to this place. Okay, I'm hopping in this taxi. I'm going to this place. Okay, there's a lot of congestion here. Could you drive me to this place instead? I'll just walk. I kind of know the way. I know a shortcut over here. Who do you actually talk to about these things? And these can be a bit complex as well. It's not that you always actually have a clear address for like, yeah, could you just drive me over there? I kind of know, I know that there's a shortcut over there. So who does this? I don't know. Then moving on to societal level. And I'm just going to go through really quickly how this is usually done, sort of how we go from low level impacts to societal impacts. And we could imagine two of these things that I've talked about previously here. That we have some sort of like increased comfort and decreased accidents rates, for example. You could imagine that these lead to some sort of increased attractiveness for the car mode in itself, which would lead to increased car use, which would lead to increased emissions. So that's kind of how we go from increased comfort to emissions, for example. At the same time, you could have decreased costs for personnel, for example, which would lead to decreased cost for using public transport, which would decrease car use because you get a better alternative as well. And then sort of the question is, okay, but what happens with overall emissions when you have all these factors in sort of interplay, and it's really hard to say, okay, which one of these is more important and which is the mostly affecting. And of course, in these types of diagrams, you have a multitude of other factors affecting emissions as well. And I'm not going to go through exactly how all of this is sort of like calculated or how we sort of estimate the impact. But more focus on the results in itself. So sort of like where does the current research stand at this point? So first of all, and this is a major KPI that we use within transportation, is some sort of accessibility. So overall, how many workplaces can I reach within 45 minutes? Is a pretty easy way to measure accessibility, for example. Other more complicated ways as well. And you could really imagine that this would heavily increase people's overall accessibility, especially for those who don't have a driver's license, or in the case with some sort of free-floating taxi, self-driving thingy, those who don't have a car, which is actually quite a lot of people, more people than you would imagine. Travel time then would probably decrease as well, mainly due to this increased accessibility. I actually have a new mode. I can't personally not only use a walking, cycling, and public transport since I don't have a car. Now there's actually a fourth alternative available as well, and for me that might be a really good alternative in some cases as well. So you have some sort of like increased accessibility, which leads to overall less travel time. And sort of like going on with this subject, of course, then you have some sort of like increased transport consumption in general. So people will do more trips in itself when you have more accessibility. But that could lead to increased congestion. Or we could have the issue that I was talking about previously, that cars are talking to each other, so everything is more effective as well, which kind of means that you could have a mixed, but you have both. It could go up, could go down. It kind of depends on assumptions. But there's probably large geographical differences here as well. Maybe this talking to each other between cars is working on the highway, but not on local roads, for example. So you could have really a lot of congestion on local roads and not really a lot of congestion on highways. Could be. Probably really context dependent here. And then you have a new factor as well, which is these sort of empty kilometers. So a car drove to pick me up, and then it needs to go somewhere else to pick someone else up. Sort of what there's a lot of like, that could be actually up to a third of all kilometers driven in some context, could just be this sort of going to the next customer as well. And we have some sort of new mode here that's not really available today. And this, of course, would affect all of the above, would lead to increased congestion if you have a lot of vehicles that need to be rerouted to somewhere else. So, yeah. Then there are other impact areas as well, affected economy, first of all. Operational costs are then likely reduced substantially. Large decreases just because you're removing the driver. For train services, this usually is less than 20% of overall costs is personnel. Differs quite a lot depending on which train mode we're actually talking about. About 50% of buses, so around 50% of the overall cost for running a bus is the driver in itself. And for taxis, this is about 70%. So you would see large reductions in taxi fares then, of course, but also to some extent for public transport. And therefore, you would probably see reduced costs for consumers as well. I mean, you could use this money for increased services or something as well, but we probably would see decreased costs overall. But then we would also have some maintenance costs, which would probably be increased. So cleaning, for example, could also be fault management, that we actually have a lot more complex technology on board of these vehicles. So maintenance costs would probably increase at the same time. And then we have infrastructure as well. This has not really been thoroughly investigated, I would say. Some authors, some researchers think that we won't really have any difference as well at all. These vehicles would just have to adopt to sort of the current system, whilst others think that, okay, we actually need sort of like 5G connection or along all major roads, for example. So here, we don't really know what the infrastructure requirements will be. Could be large differences there as well. Could be simple things as increased snow plowing as well. just to be able to see the lines which a self-driving vehicle might need. So there might be more like physical maintenance infrastructure that might be needed due to this as well. Increased road width as well might be needed, or maybe not. And then we have some sort of like wider societal impact. So we're talking about, I don't know, BNP or societal productivity and so on. And that would then likely be increased as well due to this increased accessibility. Yes, let's move on to environmental and health issues as well. Greenhouse gases, first of all, would likely increase due to the increased car use. Pollution, so local pollutant, similar, because we would have an increased car use, we would have more in pollution. Noise, similar as well. Physical exercise would also probably decrease as well, because more people are using other modes of transport. This is not only the car. It could be that if public transport costs, I don't know, half the cost, more people will be using the bus instead of going by bike, which is not really what we want, I think. Now, all of this is, of course, contingent on that we're actually still using fossil fuels, but not all of these. And I'm not going to talk about electrification today, but electrification does not solve all of these problems. It solves greenhouse gas, or not entirely, but mostly solves greenhouse gases and to some extent pollution as well. But noise and physical exercise is not really solved by this as well. And I don't think that we should just assume that we will have electric vehicles in itself. That's more of a, I think it's a good idea, but we shouldn't just assume that they're going to be widely available. Other impacts areas identified as well. Yes, I talked about injuries beforehand as well, that we could likely have a decrease there in the number of injuries, but it's more of a potential than an actual result in itself. The same goes for vehicle damages, which is, yeah, basically the same. Then we have land use. So basically, so you could see, for example, where people live, and we could sort of assume that people would then be able to live farther out if they have this more increased accessibility in general. And some sort of, and this is a bit of a more fussy area, that we have some sort of continued reliance on cars in itself, which some researchers really warn about, that we have a lot of people that we're still sort of constructing cities according to the cars instead of the people and so on. So that's sort of another possible impact area in itself. I'm not really sure what to say about it in itself. And then we have entirely new areas which might be affected with this as well. The most apparent one is unemployment, of course. That all of these drivers will be without a job, but likely this would also lead to new types of jobs at the same time, that we need more remote supervision, for example. Then we have a large area which is, and this is a bit of a problem, this is largely unexplored. Cybersecurity, which would be a big problem here. When we have all these connected cars and cars driving by themselves and so on. This is a big area of importance. Definitely an increased risk of reliance on cybersecurity. Could be that we get a more unfair transport system, actually, or more fair. It's a bit hard to know, but on this subject, I can actually recommend a breakfast seminar that we had last year from two researchers who argued that this would lead to a more unfair transport system. And I think that maybe Malin can post a link to this in the chat for those of you who are interested in finding out why they argue that this would lead to a more unfair transport system. So with this in mind, I'm just going to go through the main conclusions that I've drawn so far. First of all, that we actually have a really wide array of of areas that will be affected by this. So as you've seen, I've talked about a lot of different areas. Still, there are other factors that have not been explored, or that they've only been explored sort of for the, I don't know, average resident, instead of that we're actually seeing that we might have these variation, that 10% of the population is really afraid of flying and 90% is somewhat comfortable with it. And we actually have these, it's more of a range than an average in a sense. And we mostly looked at this on sort of the average citizen, how he or she would respond to this. And then as well, also that impacts from these are both positive, but also negative from this technology, that we have some impacts which I would say are really positive, that we have an increased accessibility, for example, but at the same time, less physical exercise is probably a bad thing for society overall. And sort of how would we actually combat this? And I think that this is sort of the next question, like, okay, but how do we actually handle this so that it turns out to be a good thing for societal goals overall? And with that, I would like to thank you for listening.
Thank you, Erik, for a very nice, interesting presentation. So you mentioned that this was part of your licentiate thesis. You had a very nice table in the thesis, right, with some of these factors.
Yes.
With all the references too.
Yes.
I guess Molly gonna post that in the
Yeah.
chat as well, if you want to dive a bit deeper into some of these factors.
Yes.
Let's see, do we have any questions here? Otherwise, I can start. So you briefly mentioned sharing. You said car sharing and trip sharing, or pooling, as it's called sometimes. There's a book from a researcher in the US called Daniel Sperling, where he talks about the three revolutions: electrification, automation, and sharing. And he's arguing that this trip sharing is a key variable for sustainable transport. What's your take on this?
I mean, so there, I think that there are two different things that need to be said here. First of all, is kind of, why are we not sharing more today? Do we really need this technology to actually share? And I would argue that people shared vehicles much more previously than we do today, when you sort of like, yeah, I can afford my own car. I know that my dad always talked about when they were like going from their house out in the archipelago, in that they actually almost always had an extra passenger, so to say, like someone from the local neighborhood who wanted to get to Stockholm for some reason. And you kind of had some increased like car sharing back then already. But I think that with all overall like economic progress, or like increased income, for example, everyone can afford their own car. And I would argue that you could have more carpooling already today.
I guess some people argue it's a low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
At least theoretically.
Yeah, but I mean, it's definitely a good thing. And I think that this leaves, I mean, you could say this about almost anything, that sharing resources in general is always a good thing, I would say. I mean, I don't really need to have all the handyman tools at home. I can actually share with my neighbors or anything, because it's not that often I'm actually using a hammer by myself, because I don't live in a villa like you.
No.
So I live in an apartment, so I don't actually use the hammer all that much. No, and that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, this does not only apply to vehicles in itself, but that sharing is always good in a sense. Like, sharing resources in general is a good thing.
But it seems like consumer behavior is slow to adapt to sharing, or slow to accept sharing. Do you think public policy is necessary here? I mean, otherwise, are we going to see increased congestion and cars running around everywhere if you don't have sharing?
So I think that, I mean, this is a pretty, I would say that people are pretty aware of what they're doing here as well. And for me to not having to adapt to someone else from using a car, for example, is a pretty big convenience as well, and actually makes it possible for me to do more errands. So I actually don't, okay, I'm just gonna buy this sofa or whatever. I don't actually have to go to a car rental place, pick up a car, go there, go home, go back to the rental place, and actually having your own car is pretty good here. But what I think that people are within, especially transport economy, you're talking a lot about that modes should sort of like incorporate their externalities as well, that you should kind of pay for all the sort of costs that your behavior, sort of like how it links to society. So the emissions from my car, I should pay for that in some way through taxes, for example, could be a good thing. And I think that for dense cities, for example, what is usually not paid for is, for example, the sort of like the congestion that I'm causing on the local road, and parking is usually extremely cheap, to be frank. Sort of when you're actually taking up, I don't know, 10 or 20 square meters of space, and basically paying, I don't know, 1,000 kronor per month. Yeah. In Stockholm, for example, which is kind of cheap when you're considering an apartment, which costs a lot more. So it's sort of subsidized in a way as well. And I think that we should sort of strive to incorporate these externalities in some way as well. And then I think that I think we will probably see a more behavior which is more better for society overall, if we sort of incorporate all these externalities.
Do you think it's going to happen automatically, or is it, you need strong public policy? I guess that's good for you.
Yeah, I mean, you need public policy. Yeah. So if you increase the cost of parking, I think that people will adapt. That's a pretty obvious one. If you, for example, as I was saying about these like empty kilometers, you could prohibit that, for example.
You have to remain in the area. The car needs to remain in
or you can't just go around aimlessly. You actually need to go somewhere. So I held a workshop a couple of months ago with some people who worked at public officials, and they were saying like, yeah, we can't really allow cars just driving around aimlessly in dense cities. That won't work. Maybe we should just disallow it entirely. And how to enforce that? Well, that's another issue, but I mean, you could definitely work with like soft and hard tools as well, both legislative and economic, or I mean, people adapt to marketing as well. Absolutely.
I guess it's a new area too, so you have to explore and experiment, I guess, too, with policy.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that if we go back to the question that you had previously about sharing as well, if you make it easier for people to share, then people are going to share more. Probably. If it is available, in a sense. I think that the e-scooters is a pretty good example of that as well, where it's actually available in your phone. You can see the destination, and there are usually a lot of e-scooters available. So I know that this is usually an option for me in the city where I am, because there's usually one around somewhere. It's pretty convenient to use. So you scan it, and that's definitely, vehicle sharing.
That's not trip sharing, unless you're two, but you're not supposed to be two.
No, you're not supposed to be two. But definitely, it's definitely resource sharing, because I'm using the same vehicle as you are usually using later.
Thank you. Simon, do we have any questions from the chat? Do we have any questions from the room? You had sharing too. Okay. Yeah, so my last question is actually, we talked about a little bit about these empty kilometers for automated vehicles, but don't we have empty kilometers nowadays as well with non-automated vehicles, where people are searching for parking? And how would they be different, do you think?
I mean, it could be just this, that you're actually going between one customer to another. We of course have that with taxis already, but taxi is a really small mode of transport. Taxi accounts for, I mean, it's less than 1% of all trips. It's not really visible when we do travel surveys, for example, in the overall picture. So it's just that this could actually increase quite a lot. The taxis definitely drive to one destination and drive somewhere else to pick someone up all the time. It's just that at the moment, that's really.
And I guess in the extreme cases, they go to the airport, drop someone off, and then they go all the way to the city.
Yeah.
But I mean, guess follow-up question then, with taxi, 70% is personnel cost. So you expect that kind of mode to increase then, I guess.
I mean, you could definitely see that.
So it's a good future industry in the taxi industry.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe not as a driver though.
No, a cleaner.
A taxi cleaner, absolutely. I think is definitely an employment possibility as well.
Good call to action here. Unless there's any questions in the chat or something you want to add. Yeah, sure.
So to reap some of the benefits that you mentioned that there may potentially be with autonomous vehicles, is it?
Do you want to come up here? Maybe, by the way, the microphone is here.
Okay.
Go. It's a long. I heard it's a long question.
Sure.
I don't want to repeat.
So with some of the potential benefits that could be reaped through autonomous vehicles, can they be reaped? Sort of, is it an all or nothing solution, or can it coexist at a sort of a minimum level of implementation, existing with existing type of traffic? Or do you need to completely change everything for it to actually reap some benefits?
I think that's something entirely new. To some, you could definitely see that that's something entirely new, so that's not really comparable in itself. I mean, you could imagine a future when you have only autonomous trains and nothing else, then it wouldn't be that much of a difference. But it's like, why? Well, sort of. I mean, we already have that in a sense. I think that also it's pretty hard to compare. I think that you actually have to have other types of policies to combat problems that might arise in itself. But I think that also we shouldn't underestimate the benefits of self-driving technology as well. I talked a bit about this like increased accessibility, but that's actually the major one. It's an extremely huge one as well. So a third of the population in Sweden do not have a driver's license at the moment. These are mostly kids, but kids actually need to go to places as well. Maybe you don't want to put a 4-year-old in a car, but the 12-year-old having access to sort of her own car mode makes it possible to have, okay, I want to go to see my friends, then I want to go to simmer practice or whatever, and then I want to do something else, which is not really doable with parents actually having other obligations as well. And you can imagine that this increased accessibility leads to a lot of, I mean, that's a really big benefit for that 12-year-old, right?
Yes.
So it's not like this is an evil technology or something that is bad or anything. It would definitely lead to benefits in itself. And then I think that we should probably welcome that, but then combat other issues in some way. I don't know how, but it's not really comparable. I don't think so.
And so that those benefits, for example, of increased accessibility, those can be felt sort of immediately, not by everybody switching over to this new sort of.
I mean, if I didn't really mention the lower parts of the Sae scale, where we have driver's assistance as well. Okay. This is actually quite a big thing. I mean, we have that partially as well. Cruise control is a pretty good example of that, where you don't actually need to control the speed of the vehicle. And nowadays, in newer cars, you have some sort of adaptive cruise control as well. So you set your speed to 100 kilometers an hour, but then if there's a vehicle going a bit slower ahead, it actually brakes beforehand as well. And that sort of adds a convenience to me as a driver as well. I love cruise control, by the way. I think it's awesome because there's one less thing to focus on. and definitely less of a mental load in itself. So you have these like positive things on the lower levels as well. And you could really imagine that it's not really a all or nothing scenario where we have self-driving cars. It could be that we have self-driving car technology on highways, which is pretty good as well, because highway driving is really boring if you ask me. Whereas we might not have city self-driving technology that might be a lot more complex, for example, but it's still pretty good that, okay, I drive my car from my home, and then when I get out on the highway, I sort of let go of the wheel and start talking to my my partner or something, and do something else.
And some adaptive cruise control now works in queues as well. So if you're stuck in traffic, you can just relax. But I guess you can't really bring up your phone. You're not supposed to do that.
I would actually read the fine print, because they're pretty clear on that you're still in charge at all times.
Hands on the steering wheel.
Yes, hands on the steering wheel, and and it's sort of like they're giving you the option, but not really taking responsibility of it. So it's a bit hard to understand what.
That's true. I mean, I guess there's been some discussions with some Tesla crashes, for example.
Oh, yeah.
Who's responsible here?
Oh yeah, and if we speak about legal things, it's pretty clear. Societal wise, not so clear.
Thank you, Erik. I think there's no questions from the chat at this moment. I think we'll leave it with this. And we have some upcoming breakfast seminars later this fall. No details yet, but we're going to get back to that. We'll send an email for the next one. So thank you, Erik.
Thank you.